Welcome to another episode of series of interviews conducted by Law and Society Trust on Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Today we have with us Niyanthini Kadirgamar. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts and also she is part of the Feminist Collective for Economic Justice. Sri Lanka's economic crisis has become a political crisis now. How do you see this crisis and how is it affecting the marginalized communities including women?
First of all, thank you, Vidura, for inviting me to be part of this interview. Sri Lanka has been through many difficult phases. We have had a protracted war, the tsunami, then in the post-war years too, the country had to go through a drought. There was a constitutional coup, and in 2019, the Easter bombing attacks happened. Just as we were emerging from the global COVID-19 pandemic, which had its own impact, we are now in the middle of a complete economic collapse. All those events in the past have in significant ways impacted impacted and added to the burden people had to bear. At the same time, the current crisis is unprecedented in Sri Lanka's post-independent history. It's also a moment that can create tremendous change and transformation, and we are yet to see how it will pan out. The crisis is at multiple levels. First and foremost, it's an economic crisis. Inflation has skyrocketed. Food prices, medicines, fuel costs have all gone up. There are food shortages as well as power cuts, fuel shortages. People are unable to obtain the fuel they need to run their small businesses and their livelihoods. And so the crisis is felt quite acutely at the household level. People are really struggling to put food on the table, and this can have long-term consequences as well. The cause for the current crisis, of course, had to do with the foreign debt payment crisis and the foreign reserves crisis. Sri Lanka has now defaulted on its foreign debt repayment obligations and is in negotiations with the IMF to obtain assistance. Foreign reserves have also dropped to dismal levels. We are now running from pillar to post to try and find funds to pay for imports, including essential imports like fuel. The crisis has now resulted in a political fallout as well. Signs of the economic crisis was apparent since 2020, and the present government did nothing to address it. Some of the policies that they had implemented, including tax concessions for businesses and for the rich segments of society, have resulted in a reduction in government revenues as well. And then the policy to ban fertilizers impacted local food production. The Rajapaksas have lost credibility, and there's a resounding demand by all the protesters from all around the country that they should resign immediately and hand over governance to an interim body. I guess the people have also realized that it's not just the result of the present government's failure, because hard questions are being posed about the abolishment of the executive presidency, for example, because people do realize that there are problems in the nature of and structure of governance in this country as well. Resentment against the political class that prioritize their own narrow interests over people's interests is also emerging now. If we are to understand the current moment, we also have to look at the longer trajectory of Sri Lanka's economic policy making. If we go back to the post-war period, we saw development funds flow into the country, but most of it was spent on large-scale infrastructure projects. It did not really result in job creation for people. It did not result in a significant upliftment of people's livelihoods and employment. And those projects were funded through borrowing loans, some at commercial rates and in the international sovereign bonds markets. The people were looking for a political change in 2015, and they elected the Yahapalaniya government into power, hoping for a change, not just in the authoritarian approach to governing, but also a change in the economic landscape. But what we really saw was that the new government continued with many of the same projects that the Rajapaksas had introduced, and in the same economic trajectory. We also went into an IMF loan during that period, while continuing to borrow and spend. And if we look at even further back, we have been through many IMF agreements in the past. A significant structural adjustment program was introduced in the late 1970s, and then Sri Lanka moved into trade liberalization. These macro policies, have a very significant impact on people's lives. For example, when Sri Lanka decided to go into a neoliberal policy change since the late 1970s, we also see how those changes have impacted women's lives and in particular women's labor. We see a migration of women from rural to urban areas into free trade zones to find employment in garment factories and manufacturing jobs. We also see women migrating from to other countries as domestic labor. And although they earned valuable foreign exchange for the country, it was in very exploitative conditions where labor protections and labor laws were not respected. And that had serious consequences for women and their families. And the potential that was possible in the rural sector as well. So the longer trajectory of how economic policies have been made in this country have also to be taken into account when we try to understand what's going on right now. It's not something that was inevitable. It was because of conscious choices successive governments have made, very often prioritizing profit making, prioritizing the interests of the affluent sections of society and less in thinking towards the welfare of the working population. The current crisis is also evolving into a social crisis, and there has been very little discussion around what's happening in the social, in terms of the social crisis. There can be long-term consequences which we are not yet able to see. But if you look at countries that have gone through similar experiences, like Greece, for example, which has gone, which is going through a dark decade, we can, to a certain extent, understand what Sri Lanka might have to face as well. The question of how the crisis is impacting young people, impacting children, has received less priority. We have seen major disruptions to education when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. But even as many countries have gone back to regular schooling, Sri Lanka is still unable to go there. We saw how examinations had to be postponed due to a shortage of paper. And given the economic conditions at home, where children are not able to access nutritional meals, the long-term consequences of health and educational achievements is something that we have to start thinking much more deeply about as well. The economic crisis, of course, is felt in all corners of the island, but it doesn't affect all people the same way. We are already able to see how certain sections of society are much more hardly hit. Daily workers, for example, the urban working poor particularly, and those in the informal labor sector have been badly affected by this crisis. The loss of incomes has put them in a very difficult situation where even when certain essential items are available, they are unable to purchase them. The communities that have been marginalized because of their ethnic, caste, and sexual orientation and religious identities are also finding this current moment very difficult to navigate. Those who are already ostracized in society and have very little access to essential services and support systems are finding it much more difficult to navigate the current crisis. Of course, all of these changes in the larger economic and political spheres eventually manifest within the homes. Women are disproportionately having to bear the consequences of this economic crisis. They are still expected to put food on the table and to look after families, to involve in care work, while having to continue to look for livelihood incomes to support the family. And this is causing tremendous pressure on women. Women's labor has always been invisibilized. Although I mentioned earlier that women are the main earners of foreign revenues for the country in the plantation, in the manufacturing sector, and through foreign remittances, women's social reproductive role in households, in the care economy have not been recognized. And very often the discourse around women's labor is that there is low participation in the formal sector. However, I think this is also a moment to think about the role of women in the economy and not just in paid work, but also in the unpaid work that women perform.
Now, economic crisis is creating a humanitarian crisis in the country. As general public, we don't have a proper idea how deep this crisis will be. In your view, what sort of humanitarian issues we will have to expect in the future? And what are the short-term measures we can take to mitigate these humanitarian issues?
There is a concern that a humanitarian crisis is emerging in the country, by a humanitarian crisis, what is meant is that there is a food crisis, where people are not able to find basic food items at an affordable cost, and the shortages of medical and medical equipment and medicines. We can't wait until the larger economic solutions come through to address food shortages and medicine shortages. We have to have a plan in place in the short term to ensure that people are not starving. We can't allow people to make very difficult choices of buying food versus buying medicine, which is the current situation right now. There is a need for the government to provide immediate relief in terms of distributing food rations to people, particularly in the lower economic bracket. There is also a need to ensure basic nutritional items are always available. And to do that, a food distribution system has to be set up where prices are also controlled for essential basic items. Beyond that, I think we can't think of the current crisis as from a humanitarian lens alone. There needs to be a deeper understanding of what's going on in the country. As I mentioned before, it's a economic, political, and social crisis, and this has been brought about by conscious choices made over several years, and the underlying issue of class interest is very much present in how solutions are provided to people's suffering right now. In addition, the current crisis has made it immensely clear for the need for social protection to help people face risks and unexpected loss of incomes. While Sri Lanka has had progressive social security networks in the past, we have seen that in recent years how they have been narrowed mainly to cash transfers. For example, the Samurdhi program, which provides social security for almost 1.8 million people in the country, has a cash transfer program with a maximum of 4,500 rupees provided to a household of 4 people. What we are seeing is that with the value of the rupee depreciating and inflation going up, the cash transfers are hugely inadequate to address people's basic nutritional need, which is the kind of logic that the Samurdhi program uses to determine cash transfers. At the same time, we are also seeing many more people fall into poverty. And the recent World Bank statistics also show that there is an increase in poverty levels in Sri Lanka right now. And these are concerns in the short term that can have adverse effects. We do not know how it will pan out in Sri Lanka, but in other countries we have seen the risk of food riots happening as well. Therefore, it's a priority for us to address the food security for the people.
Many now see IMF as our only savior. What do you think about this view?
Well, the government has already approached the IMF for assistance to provide a loan and a debt and assistance to restructure its foreign debt. So we can only right now talk about what the government could have done differently. We are being told again and again by government and experts in the economic think tanks and so on that this is the only solution to get out of an economic crisis. Meaning, you go to the IMF, you obtain a loan, and you have access to the markets to borrow foreign loans again. And that way you continue into another cycle of borrowing and repaying. That seems to be what they are proposing as the ideal solution to address an economic crisis. The question, though, is if the government had paid attention to addressing the crisis in 2020, were there other options or other ways in which the government could have addressed it? And secondly, if successive governments had had different policy programs, would we have even ended up in this crisis? Were there opportunities to prioritize imports of unessential items in the last 2 years? Did the government even make an attempt to do that? Would we have ended up in this crisis if successive governments did not decide to borrow from international sovereign bond markets or go for loans with high interest rates? Would we have been in a better place if we had obtained loans that have long payback periods? What about mobilizing resources locally? Have governments tapped into better taxation programs to tax those earning higher incomes or those with property and who have higher wealth? Have we thought about mobilizing the resources that we have locally to increase exports? Have we thought about increasing local production? We have seen how the agriculture sector has been neglected for decades. We have seen the lack of resource investments into those sectors that can produce locally and for local consumption, but also to increase exports. Would we have ended up in this crisis if those policy considerations have been given greater priority? These are some of the questions I think people have been asking in relation to the IMF. Is there a different way than to say this is going to be a bitter pill that we have to swallow in order to fix the ailments in the economy? Why is it that working people are being subjected to an austerity program? Why is it that it's the people at the lower strata of society who have to bear the brunt of this economic crisis? We surely must have other ways of addressing it. And this goes back to the question of political values and interests that very often inform these decisions.
How will the austerity policies, including IMF recommendations, affect the people? Have the IMF recommendations for other countries affected state welfare in those countries? And what are the results of such effects on state welfare?
The IMF has a standard set of recommendations that they usually put forward to countries that are facing a crisis like Sri Lanka is facing. And that is to address the fiscal accounts and its deficit. The IMF will recommend that taxes are increased, including indirect taxes, and this is a concern when food prices and essential items are already unaffordable to people. What would it mean to impose taxes and raise prices again in this situation for people and their survival? Secondly, the IMF will recommend that government expenditure is reduced. Again, the question is, where are the cuts going to occur? Will the government reduce welfare provided by the state for education, for health, for pensions, for social security, and subsidies for farmers, for fishermen? Um, are we going to see major cuts in state social welfare? Or are we going to see um, privatization happen? Will state-owned enterprises be privatized? Will we see cuts to utilities uh, like electricity, water, transport? Would it mean then that we will have to end up paying more for those services? There is already a move to increase the price of electricity, for example. Uh, what would that mean for people if they are unable to afford electricity, water, and subsidized transport services? So these are some of the concerns that people have with an austerity program. When the economy is already in a depression, what wouldn't it make more sense for the government to invest more in sectors and help um, revive livelihoods and ensure social security is provided for people to really be able to come out of this crisis? What the IMF program proposes is just the opposite. And in addition, trade liberalization will continue to be encouraged. And the question there is like, how are we going to address the trade deficit situation? Are we going to be able to attract enough foreign earnings in without investing into uh, productive uh, industries or encouraging exports? Are we only going to be dependent on tourism when the global situation with the Ukraine war and other uncertainties are still on the horizon? Are we going to be able to bring back remittances to the levels that they were in pre pandemic? I mean, these are some of the questions that we should be asking.
What are the long-term steps should be taken to overcome this crisis? And what sort of special attention should be given to women and other marginalized communities when implementing these short-term and long-term measures to overcome this crisis?
Sri Lanka is not the only country that is in trouble for its foreign debt obligations. Economists have warned that debt of developing countries are reaching unsustainable levels. Therefore, there is a need to rethink our approaches to economic fundamentals. Are we actually going to continue in this cycle of austerity measures and implement and going into further borrowing? It doesn't seem sustainable. There are also other global challenges like climate crisis, which can push us to reevaluate our reliance on global supply chains and perhaps think of making food sovereignty an important aspect. The current moment in Sri Lanka is also defined by the failure of a political project to elect a technocrat leader in order to push through deeper neoliberal economic reforms. Perhaps now is a time for us to think of alternatives, and alternatives that are based on economic justice and economic democracy. A program that is based on these values have to take the rising inequalities seriously and commit towards a redistribution of wealth and resources. Adequate investments in social infrastructure like education and health have to be prioritized. Thirdly, investing in livelihoods of people is important if we are to come out of this crisis and generate enough production. Invest where the people are instead of trying to migrate people into sectors that are sometimes deemed more preferable. In Sri Lanka, most people are in the informal sector and in the rural agricultural sector, and that is where future investments should be directed to. Finally, the question of labor has to be contended with in a more serious fashion. Who are the people who are contributing to the country's economy? Very often, women's labor is, as I mentioned before, is not recognized. So the need to value women's labor and to compensate them adequately is important as well.
Niyanthini Kadirgamar, thank you very much for joining with us for this discussion.